Welcome to the Zoomer. I'm Libby Znaimer. Canadians are getting nickeled and dimed from tip-flation to point-of-sale tipping to hidden junk fees. A new Angus Reid poll found that nearly 65% of Canadians say they've been asked to tip more often and to dole out larger tips. Meanwhile, 59% of Canadians surveyed would prefer an all-inclusive no-tipping model at restaurants. There's also evidence that we are shelling out more in tips. Over the last 5 years, the average gratuity has jumped from 16 to 20%. And although inflation is hitting all aspects of our lives, tipflation continues to balloon, and we are tired of it. So we are asking the question, has tipflation reached a tipping point? Let's bring in the panel. Welcome. Ellen, has tipflation reached a tipping point?
Well, it definitely is easier for companies now to put the terminal in your face and to give you this tip, a range of tips, but the range of tips doesn't start at 10%, and there's often not a button to say, I don't really want to tip. So sometimes you're seeing like 18%, 22%, and it's, you know, you're losing your ability to decide whether or not to tip, especially when something's really small. If it's under like $2.50 or $3, if you're just buying a single cup of coffee, you may not want to tip on the terminal.
Lauren, is there a generational difference in that?
Absolutely not. I agree with Ellen. I think that it's become almost impossible not to tip these days. They turn the iPad around when you go to buy, say, a prepackaged juice at a coffee shop. Nobody even prepared that for me directly. I grabbed it from a shelf myself, and they turn around the iPad, and it's like 18%, 20%, 22%. And I just have to be like, oh, 0, like alternate, or more often than not, because I feel bad, I'm just like, sure, 18%. And, you know, it adds up over time. I think we see from a lot of our readers at BlogTO, people are complaining about it across all generations. It's just becoming kind of an unavoidable tipping point, as you say.
I agree 100%. And here's the thing is that when they flip around that iPad, in order to say 0, you can't really say 0. You got to hit custom, and then you got to put 0 in. And that's by design, right? It is at that point of purchase to tell people, no, click on the big, large number that's first, and it's not the 5%, 10%, it's the 20% that's first. And yeah, I think it's reached a tipping point.
Yeah, it's interesting. What we found at Richmond Station in the research we did before we decided to eliminate tips is that actually the studies in the United States and Israel show that when that terminal gets flipped around to you, people just press the same button every time, regardless of what they bought or regardless of the service. The data bears out pretty easily there. If you're an 18% tipper, you're an 18% tipper. If you're a 22% tipper, you're a 22% tipper. And actually, the product you've bought or the service you've received bears little in people's decision-making in that process. So that's even more interesting. Is it reflective of your intention at all?
So, going back to how we got here, there's quite the history of tipping, and it's not a good history. It involves a lot of racism.
That is right. And unfortunately, this is yet another really bad export from the United States to Canada, which is really that this whole system originates in slavery, our original sin in the United States. You know, tipping as a practice originated in feudal Europe. It was something that aristocrats and nobles gave to serfs and vassals, always on top of a wage. It came to the United States in the 1850s when rich Americans started traveling to Europe and coming back and trying to show off that they knew the rules of Europe. And at first, Americans resoundingly rejected it. There was a populist movement against tipping. It actually resulted in 7 states in the US banning tipping. They said we're a democracy and employers should pay their workers, not customers. And we're not feudal Europe, and therefore we reject this. And that populist movement spread to Europe, and the labor movement picked it up in Europe with the rallying cry of, we are professionals, we don't rely on your tips. It's no longer feudalism, and got rid of tipping in much of Europe. That movement that started in the US really went away at emancipation, when the restaurant industry basically wanted the right, the ability to hire newly freed Black people, Black women in particular, not pay them anything at all, and have them live exclusively on this newfangled idea that had just come from Europe called tipping. And I do want to say that was the first moment in world history that tipping became a replacement for wages rather than an extra or bonus on top of a wage, as it had always been since feudal times. And it was that unique desire to pay Black people nothing and let them live on the largesse of white customers that led to the United States currently having a pretty shameful and outrageous minimum wage for tipped workers of $2.13 an hour in the year 2023. 43 states in the US persist with this legacy of slavery with a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers that requires a workforce that's now immense. 14 million workers in the US work in this industry, 1 in 10 American workers. And in most states, 43 out of 50 states, they can be paid this ridiculous sub-minimum wage with the idea that tips will bring them to the full minimum wage. Now, that exists in some provinces in Canada as well. And what we're seeing, what we've been tracking this kind of tip-flation for the last many years, even pre-pandemic, what we are seeing is with the introduction of Apple Pay and Google Pay, basically other sectors are trying to emulate this really, frankly, racist exemption that the restaurant industry has had for 160 years.
Closer to the current moment, I think that the current round of tipflation started with people wanting to support the emergency workers during the pandemic, low-paid essential workers.
Yeah, I mean, during the pandemic, all of the frontline workers were putting themselves at risk to bring us our food, to go out, drive us around to hospitals and things like that. So I think people definitely were generous when they were getting their Uber Eats orders or they were taking taxis around. I think it definitely kind of incentivized people to tip more than they normally would have, and that hasn't really gone away.
And is it a matter now that you can't sort of take away what you offered in the pandemic? Is it a matter, well, we started in the pandemic and we can't stop this?
Well, it's gratuity for a reason, right? And I think at that time we were gratuitous, right? It was the fact that frontline workers were putting their lives on the line based on the information that we were given at that moment. There was a lot of uncertainty. There were a lot of questions. There was this big movement to support workers, but small businesses as well. But can you put the toothpaste back in the tube, I guess, right? Can we work backwards? I think we can. I think the fact that we're even having this conversation is indicative of the fact that we're really asking these questions now. Is this the way culturally we want to move forward?
Well, we have to take a short break. We'll be right back with more of the Zoomer.